Hello. These are my tips for sewing faux fur or real fur or any kind of fur. So my first tip is to use high quality fabric scissors. These are Ginger dressmakers shears, I think they're called. Ginger is a high quality brand. These are really nice because they cut all the way to the very tip. So I'm actually going to show you some cutting tips. This piece that I'm working on, the seam allowance right here, it's a little too thick, so I'm going to trim that down. And a lot of people will take just a razor blade and sort of cut the back like this so that they don't cut the hair, this fur on this side. I find that takes a long time and it can be sort of daunting. So what I like to do is use really nice scissors, and then all you have to do is make sure you're just using the correct technique when you cut it. So instead of something like this, where I just put my scissors on and start chopping away, this is going to cut all of my hair, and you're going to get a very abrupt edge rather than this nice edge where the hair is still there. So in order to get a cut edge that looks like this with scissors, all you have to do is stick your scissors in at the root of the hair like this and start with a very small cut. Just making sure I can do this right. Yeah, so start with a very small cut like that. And as long as you are scooting it along the root, you're going to be just fine. There will be some hair that you cut, but this nice edge that I showed you, this is a cut edge, so it's going to look just as nice. See, if I move this aside, you can see that that's a really nice edge. Once you have cut your fabric, and take all this scrap. If it's a big enough piece, keep it, of course, but this is just scrap because it's a small piece. So take your scrap, throw it away, and the next thing you want to do is get rid of any excess hair. So on a lot of the time on a cut edge, there will be a lot of excess hair. See all this here? Partially because of cut hairs and partially because the fabric will unravel slightly at the edge, which will release any hair that's attached at the root there. So get rid of any excess hair, because when you run this through your sewing machine, you don't want all this hair potentially getting sucked into your sewing machine and causing problems in there with lint and stuff like that. When you are pinning fur, you want to make sure that the wrong side of the fabric does not have any fur sticking out. Sometimes this can be a little tricky, so I'm going to show you how to do that. And the reason you want the fur on the other side is because this, of course, is the right side of the fabric where you want all the fur to be. And also you don't want it causing troubles when you're trying to get this through your sewing machine. This is a much cleaner piece of fabric to pass through your sewing machine. So if you take this edge here, for example, I'm putting these two pieces together where the fur is running in the same direction. So on this piece running this way, and this piece it's running this way, but that means that this edge has all this hair hanging off of it. This edge looks nice and clean, so that doesn't seem too tricky. But to join these two pieces, if I were to just take this and slap them together, you can see there's hair sticking out all over the place. If I just pin this, this is really messy, and on the other side you don't get as much hair. So what you want to do instead is lay this out flat and make sure that that's nice and flat. Then you take this other piece, comb this out a little bit, and then you're just going to set this on top of the other one like that. Okay, and you're only going to worry about small sections at a time. So for example, we're only going to worry about from here to here. So you take this, and then you can just sort of pinch it and lift it up. You can see automatically all the hair is on the other side. My next tip is about pinning. So normally when you're sewing or pinning a piece of fabric, you just take your pin, you shove it in, you move it over just like that, and then you move along, everything's hunky-dory. The problem comes when you're using faux fur. There's a lot of squishiness in between these layers. So what happens is, if you just take your pin and you put it in perpendicular like that, and then you bend it over, what you're doing is you're actually moving this piece of fabric over here, and you're moving this one that way, so that you're just sort of wrenching them so that they slide past each other in the process of pinning, which means that if you have a long piece, by the time you get to the other end of the seam, your fabric's going to be all wonky and the two ends won't line up over there. So instead what you want to do is, when you're pinning, go in at an angle. So instead of going perpendicular, go in a little sideways like this. That way, when you're pinning it, you're not creating such a shearing movement on your fabric, and it's less movement between the two pieces. And always make sure that you check often all the way down to the other end to make sure that the ends are still lining up. So my next tip is about organization of your pieces. So if you see this piece here, I suppose this applies not only to faux fur but other stuff. But this piece here I have, each piece is labeled. So I used actually permanent marker so that it wouldn't accidentally rub off, because I know there's going to be a lot of pinning on this project, and I know that the marker is not going to show through because it's faux fur. So use markers. Markers are good. And this is the front half of the tail that I'm working on. So if you see, this piece says 1F. F means front, 2F, 3F, 4F, etc. So they all go together like this. And I also mark, I can't see it here, but the paper pieces have an arrow on it to show which direction the fur should be going, because when you cut pieces out of fur, that's really important. I don't have it here because the fur is already cut and I don't need to know anymore. I can just look at this side to see. The other thing that I did is I made a line where the sewn edge is going to be for the first seam, so that when I pick up a random piece, I can sort of tell where it should go. For example, I have this huge pile of pieces over here, so the fact that they're all labeled is really going to help me. So I pick one up. The last one here is 4, so I'm looking for 5. Say, okay, there's 5, and I know that this one of these two sides is the side that's going here. I can tell which one it is if I look at which way the hair is going, because I know this entire piece needs to have hair in the same direction. So I can see the hair is going this way, the hair needs to go in the same direction. This is the side where you sew it, so I need to pin it here. It really takes a lot of the guesswork out, and faux furs are really expensive, so organization is doubly important, because if you fuck it up, you've just lost a lot of money in fabric. You can see I carried this all the way through all the pieces. And the other set of pieces is for the back side of the tail, so they say like 11B instead of 11F for back. Sometimes when you have enough layers, or sorry, not enough layers, but enough pieces going on, it becomes impractical to do the other technique where you just pinch it together to keep the hair out of the seam. So another way is just to use your finger, in this case like this, and I'm going to have a part of the tail at the end that's going to be even more difficult because both pieces have the hair coming out, but this piece is not too bad because the hair is both going in that direction. So you just use your finger and then pin it. Check it to make sure it's still kind of lining up. When you have 4 pieces coming together like this, you're going to have this big bulky seam that you already sewed. This is the new seam that I'm pinning. This seam that I already sewed. So the problem is that when you're sewing along here, as soon as you get to here, all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of layers. You got this side too. You might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers to sew through at a time, and it's hard enough with just 2 layers. So this is really important. You're going to want to make sure that you lessen the bulk around this area, because 6 layers is just not going to happen in a sewing machine. So you can just take some very sharp scissors, and you can just cut at a diagonal this bulk right off like that. Don't worry about the hair or anything, this is going to be on the inside, so that's not a big deal. But once you cut this, you can see that you should be able to sew over this without too much extra difficulty. And don't forget to do this on the other side as well. This is actually not enough of an angle because if you see this line, it's still very thick right here, where I'm going to have to sew past that line, so I'm going to cut it again to make sure I get that angle the way it needs to be. There we go. Double check the other side. Yeah, the other side is pretty good. Alright. So here's the end I was telling you about, where the hair is in that direction for both pieces. So this would be the hardest example of a seam where you would want to try and get the hair on the inside, but you don't need to do anything special, you just have to be a little more persistent. So just use your finger, just like you would anywhere else. And it's just slightly harder, but not any different. You still want the seam to be nice and clean when it goes through your sewing machine. So tuck the hair in, pin it, and you're good to go. So now that all of our seams are sewed, there's one thing that I think a lot of people miss when they're working with really thick fabric like this, and it doesn't only go for faux fur, it goes for other thick fabric. When you have curves like this, so this curves around like this, and there's big curves around the outside like this as well, if you just turn this inside out as it is, it's going to be bending the other direction, and what will happen is it starts to really buckle inside there, and it can create some lumps and bumps that sort of ruin the effect. So what you need to do to correct that is you need to cut notches in this so that it takes up less space and it's less bulky. So for example, just take your scissors, cut a little notch like so, and so you're going to want to put notches like this, I don't know, maybe for a curve this big, maybe every inch or so, maybe every 2 inches, something like that. You can even turn it inside out and try it, see if it's less bulky. If you think you need to do more, you can obviously turn it wrong side out again and cut more notches. And this goes for the other type of curve as well, because this curve is actually going to be like this on the inside, and it's going to be pulling on this. So if you cut notches, it sort of relieves the pressure on this fabric and lets it splay open a little bit more. The reason why I think that cutting notches is better than cutting close to the seam, like cutting the entire seam off, is because you want to make sure that the seam still has some meat to it, because if you accidentally cut a little too close to your seam, it could unravel and it would be really hard to fix because there wouldn't be any fabric left there for you to restitch it to. You'd have to have a whole new seam allowance again. So by just cutting notches, you're allowing it to still have meat to hang on to, and cutting the bulk so that when it does curve in, it still works. And you can get really close to the string or the thread, but don't cut the thread because then it will unravel. So get close to the thread, but don't cut the thread. And every inch or two for a curve like this, and should be good when you turn it inside out again. So I'm going to show you sewing one seam just to give you an idea of what it's like. So this, where you marked with the marker when tracing your pieces, this is where you're going to try to sew along. And this piece is already pinned. Make sure that you do pin it, because pinning is very important. This is really hard fabric to work with. It doesn't matter what color of thread you're using because the thread is not going to show. Yeah, so let's show you how this is done. So this fabric is really thick, and it's a really big pain in the butt, at least for my machine, to get it under the presser foot. So what I usually do is I stand up, because I have to find the right leverage, and where the pin is holding it down, that pinches it so it's really small. So I usually try to get it on using those areas, and then I move it around once it's underneath there. So I kind of shimmy it underneath like this. Shimmy, shimmy, shimmy. And I bring it even farther than it has to go. I know the black line is where I'm going to sew, but I want to pull it even further that way, because if I need to correct it, it's easy to pull it out again. So I push it farther than it needs to go. And then I can sit back down. I don't use a lot of force. It's just easier when I stand up for some reason. So I'm pulling this thread to the back again, because when you push it under, sometimes it gets angled off to the side or something. You always want your thread to be coming out the back. It's true for the top thread and the bottom thread. So make sure that those are to the back before you start sewing. So the first thing you want to do is remove the first pin. Always remove the pins before you sew. You never want to sew over a pin because you could damage your machine. So I remove the first pin. Now I can pull it back into place and try to find that black line. I'm going to try to center the black line where I can see through this little hole here. So I'll pull it back out. The thread's getting messed up again, but that's okay, we can fix it. So I've centered the black line, and now I'm pulling it until I can see the corner where the two black lines meet, because that's where I want to start my seam. And the marker's a bit faded, so it's kind of hard to see, but I think that's about it. So now there's like the thread here is a bit loose because I've pulled it out. So I'm just going to find the back of it and pull it tight again. Same with the bottom thread. Okay, once I found the sweet spot there with the corner, I'll lower my needle manually just to make sure that it's really got it. And yeah, it's right in the middle of that corner now, so that's exactly where I want it. And make sure you lower your presser foot. You're going to make sure that you probably want less pressure in the presser foot. This is an adjustment on your machine. I'll show you on mine later, but for thin fabric, obviously it can squeeze a lot tighter, but because this is so thick, we don't want it to push too hard, so you're going to have to probably adjust that. You may not have to adjust it, but you should at least test with 2 pieces of scrap of the same fabric you're going to be sewing, just to make sure that all the settings on your machine are going to work, because you don't want to mess up on your actual project. So always test new kinds of fabric, like if you have lots of layers or anything, even if you worked with it before, try a swatch with that number of fabric in it, just to make sure that everything's going to go to plan when you actually start sewing. So the next thing you want to do is, I usually start the first stitch by hand, just cranking the wheel and making sure that the fabric is moving freely. Because this is so thick, sometimes the edge or something might catch on the feed dogs, or you don't know what's happening. So I always do 1 stitch to make sure that everything's moving okay and there's no problems that I know of, and then I can get going. So just as with anything, you always want to back tack at the beginning of your seam. So you go a little bit, back tack, and you can go forward again. One of the reasons why this fabric is so time consuming to sew is because you need so many pins to keep the hair in to the seams. So you have to stop pretty frequently to remove the pins. One of the things I'm doing, just to let you know, is I'm pulling this, and I'm using this thumb to kind of guide the marker towards the needle, because I always want the needle to go on this marker, because that's where I want the seam to be. If I don't do that, because there's hair in between the layers, they tend to slip and slide past each other, so you want to make sure that you're really doing a good job of guiding it in there after you take the pin out, because there's nothing holding it here. So your hand is going to have to do that work. And go as slow as you need to go. Another pin. Yeah. My fabric's kind of wrinkling up right here. I stopped it just before I got to the needle so I could fix that before it actually got sewn into place. I don't think that would actually be a big deal on the front side. I don't think you could see it, but I think that's also happening because of this pin here is holding the fabric, and it's not letting it flow with the movement of what's happening with the needle. So I remove that, and then I'm actually going to lift my presser foot and loosen that wrinkle a little bit, just so it's smooth when it goes through. Sometimes some of the hair might start to squeeze out a little bit as you go. You can see this is kind of puffing out. It'll be okay. And on the other side I'll show you. You can kind of pull it out a little bit and you can sort of tell where this is, but that's not too big of a deal really in the grand scheme of things. Plus, I don't really know how to prevent that, so it's gonna have to be okay. But it really does look fine. So we're coming to the edge here. I'm only going to sew to the end of where the marker is. I guess you could sew all the way off the end of the fabric, but I'm kind of a perfectionist, so I like to follow my lines as close as I can. Hopefully you can see the marker ends about here. And I'm going to sew to the end and then back tack. Back tack a couple times, just to be thorough. And then cut your threads. I'll show you the other side really quick. Well, first I'll show you the seams. So hopefully the lighting's not too good here, but I sewed pretty good right on the marker, and then the other side, hopefully if the seam allowances were the same, you're on the marker. You can see it's a little bit off in some places, but again, not a big deal. So let me see if I can find, so you see where the fiber's squished out a little bit in the seam. Oh, this is lighting. There we go. Kind of see it. See them squished out a little bit, so let's look at the other side just to show you. That looks like you can't even tell. It's right here. You can't even tell. So it's just fine. So there you go, there's sewing two pieces together. Hopefully this helps give you the confidence to give her a try. And always practice. You know, once you try it and it works okay on your swatches, you'll feel much better about actually digging into your project. I use a regular straight stitch at the longest length. So on my machine I've got a length setting and then a stitch setting and a width setting. So for me, so this is the one that's selected, and I'm on the red dot, so that means this side. And this side, when it has a width of 0, is just a straight stitch. If it had a wider width, it would be a zigzag. But if you see at the top this S, that means there's no width at all, so it's just a straight stitch. Maybe S is for straight, I don't know. There's other numbers here, there's like a 1, 2, 3, so you can widen it if you want. But so just a regular straight stitch, and then the widest width. On mine, 6 is the widest because the longest, sorry. Also, I can never remember, so I always label my machine. 6, it goes from 6 to 12, and then there's another setting here, I'm not sure what it does, but 6 means 6 stitches per inch, so they're the longest ones. 12 means 12 per inch, so they would be shorter. So that's why 6 is the longest one. So long straight stitch, and straight stitch is just your basic stitch, so that's good enough for this project. And you want it to be long because there's a lot of meat in between the two layers, and if you try to have them too close together, your threads might get gummed up and they could break and cause issues. So this is the setting that I found works the best for me. The other thing you're gonna want to worry about is potentially the presser foot pressure. So for me, this is adjusted up here. So if I want a tighter pressure, I push this down, and so that will give more pressure on the presser foot when it's pressed down. And if I want less pressure, I can release that. So this is as loose as it can be. I usually keep it about like that. Normal sewing would be like maybe like this, but always test your fabric, and if it looks okay, then you're probably fine. You shouldn't have to worry about thread tension. So this is my top thread tension, and rarely should you ever have to do anything with the bottom thread tension, which is like in the shuttle casing thing down there. As long as your sewing machine has been in use and hasn't had any issues, you shouldn't have to do anything with the thread tension. You probably won't even have to do anything with the presser foot tension, just if it seems like it's not moving very well through the presser foot, then you might play with the presser foot pressure and see if that helps. But as long as you're using the right stitch, so very long, straight stitch, it should work just fine. When you're sewing 4 pieces together, you're going to have this cross seam to deal with. As you can see, this is the first seam that I sewed, and now when I'm sewing 2 pieces of 2 together here, this is the other seam that you have to sew over. I showed you earlier in the video how to trim this. So you trim this, or at least I do, I trim this when I'm pinning. So I pin about to here, and then I trim both sides, and then I continue to pin. It makes it easier to pin past this too. And when you start to sew, you might notice that you haven't trimmed enough, because not only do you have to trim near the line where the needle itself is going to be, but if you, like me, have a standard presser foot, the presser foot comes out farther past the needle too, and that's going to need to pass over this as well. So there's a chance that you're going to need to stop at about this point in your sewing to actually trim this a little bit more. Be careful not to cut the thread. And you can also see on my piece here how this marker line and this marker line don't really line up. I'm actually not 100% sure how that happened, but at any rate, don't worry about suddenly jutting over from one marker line to get to the other to make sure that you follow all your lines, because the important thing here is a smooth seam in the end. So if you follow your lines perfectly and they don't line up, it's not going to look good. So instead what you want to do is a little bit of correction here, where after you get to the end of this line, you just slowly make your way back to the first line in a gradual way, instead of trying to somehow turn a corner and come over here. So don't worry too much about stuff like this. Just do your best to make the line nice and smooth. And the other thing is, when you're sewing past this bulky part here, and there's one of these nubs on the other side too, you're probably going to have to slow way down and potentially even help feed it through, and instead of using the pedal, use the hand crank. I always use the hand crank for this part here, because I don't want to risk breaking a needle or breaking my thread or anything like that. So I always take extra caution when I come to these. And I've removed the pin from here already, so I'm going to just continue on so you can see. So I go until the presser foot gets to this edge, and then, actually I got a couple more I can do. Then I start manually going, and I'm trying to aim it so that I can line up. I'm going to do a gradual line. So I'm going to aim it a little sideways, so the intent is that the seam will come and follow the marker line on the other side eventually. So I'm just using the hand crank to slowly make my way past here. If you have a big enough bump and it just won't fit under, you can try lifting the presser foot too. That might help. You can see it doesn't actually lift that much because there's so much bulk under there. It's almost lifted all the way already, just with the fabric. So just slowly make your way by hand. Don't forget to remove your pins. Sometimes they're really buried in there and I have to use a tool or something to help get the pin out. Okay. here. By the way, guys, something like this as your pin holder is awesome. Magnetic, so you can just, rather than trying to find a blank spot where you have to push it into like those little tomatoes, you can just throw it on this and it sticks because it's a magnet. Greatest sewing investment so far, except for the actual sewing machine. And once you get past it, you can just continue on as normal, and the rest is pretty much the same as the other little clip.